This is Women Talking Mitzvot, brought to you by Deracheha and the Stella K. Abraham Migdal Oz Women's Beit Midrash as part of their commitment to bringing women's spiritual worlds into halachic discourse. This entire podcast series has been graciously sponsored by Sigal and Zach in honor of Women's Talmud Torah, Women's Halacha Study, and in merit of Am Yisrael. All of these episodes draw on the rich sources and discussions of Women&Mitzvot on Deracheha.org. This episode is a bit different from all their episodes, just like the seder-night is different from all their nights. We speak about the seder-night mitzvah of Sippur Yetziat Mitzrayim, telling the story, and discuss the challenges of fulfilling it. Throughout this episode, we offer some Torah thoughts and insights on key passages of the Magid section of the Haggada.
Hi, Yosefa.
Hi, Shana.
I'm so happy to be here with you to talk about Pesach. The Seder night is only 2 weeks away, and it's great to have an opportunity to discuss content and issues related to the Seder, instead of just thinking about all the cleaning that we need to do or the plans that we need to make. And we made a decision that even though this podcast is called Women Talking Mitzvot, we are actually not going to be discussing the classic mitzvot of Pesach, of matzah, maror, and the 4 cups of wine on this episode. So anyone who's interested in the details of these important mitzvot and women's obligation in them should check out the amazing Pesach articles that are on the Deracheha website, written by Rabbanit Lori Novik, which are linked to in the show notes. What we did want to do is focus on the mitzvah of Sippur Yetziat Mitzrayim, which is the mitzvah on the Seder night to tell the story of how the Jewish people went from slavery to freedom. And we're given actually specific instructions about how we're supposed to do this, meaning we're supposed to start by referencing our humble beginnings, which could either be our beginnings as idol worshippers on a spiritual level or as slaves, on the physical plane, and then end with praise and discussion of how far we came, both spiritually and physically. This is known as Deracheha B'Gnud with a Sayim B'Shvach. And we're also supposed to talk about the Karban Pesach, which is the sacrifice that was brought on Erev Pesach and then eaten at the Seder, which was an essential feature of the holiday, which unfortunately we don't have today, as well as about the matzah and the maror.
I think that specifically the mitzvah of telling our story, right, of recounting in whatever detail, right, that halacha also requires of us to do, and in the way that we also really expand on that within the family setting. I think that this mitzvah is so significant also today, meaning on one hand, it's also the backbone of the Jewish peoplehood, meaning it's the story that we've grown up on. It's that thing we pass along. We know that humans are story-based. We're story-based learners. We need a narrative. We need a frame. And that's true for all humans. But I think that aside from the fact that it also sits at the root of who we are as a people, and we're going to get to that in a moment and how we quantify that and give that form, I think that we know in the world today how significant this is because there are so many nations and peoples that don't have their story clear. And we've been seeing the backlash of that, meaning nations who it reflects itself in the legal proceedings, right? Who's there, who lives there, who doesn't live there, the question of who's part of our story. If you're part of the story, you feel invested in that nation, you want it to flourish. And if you don't feel part of that and you don't have a common story and a common narrative, okay, then we see that so many countries have been flailing. And I think that this piece, which is important for us on Seder night, we see even today on the geopolitical level how significant it is and how when we don't share a common story, that it starts really unraveling the fabric of peoplehood.
Yes. And that's why it's especially meaningful for me that when it comes to the central mitzvah of Pesach, women are also obligated in them, even though we know that they're mitzvah to seisha zman grama. They're the positive time-bound mitzvah that usually women are exempt from. So there's a debate over specifically the obligation of women in Sippur Yetziat Mitzrayim, the mitzvah of telling the story, whether it's d'oraita from the Torah or whether it's d'Rabbanan from the rabbis. But there is widespread agreement that women are obligated, with one of the main explanations for women's obligation being what we have come back to a few times, afhin hayu b'to hanes, that they too were involved in the miracle, a concept that we've discussed before on the last episode related to Purim, and it came up also around Hanukkah, that women are sometimes obligated in certain positive time-bound holiday-related mitzvot because they too either were also beneficiaries of all the miracles that were done, like in Egypt, or because women themselves helped effectuate these miracles, that they were a big part of the story. So in this case, when we're talking about Egypt and the story of our redemption, it's the righteous women of Bnei Israel that we know included very specific individual women, such as Yocheved and Miriam, who were the mother and the sister of Moshe Rabbeinu, and who played crucial roles in the emergence, of him and his coming onto the scene, and Shifra and Puah, who were the midwives who very courageously risked their lives to disobey the orders that Paro gave them to kill all the male Jewish babies. But I think that these righteous Jewish women also refer to all of the unnamed Jewish women, all of the nameless wives and mothers in the story who really courageously continue to have hope and to give hope to their battered, enslaved husbands. In various midrashim, we read about different accounts of how the women would look in the mirrors and they would beautify themselves so that they could go out to the fields and they could bring their husband.
And we know from our episode on makeup that mirrors was not a common item in ancient world.
Right, and we hear about those mirrors later, that they donated those mirrors to the Mishkan. And, and there's that midrash that says, why would we want mirrors that are so superficial? And says, because these were the mirrors that the women of Egypt used in order to beautify themselves for the husbands when they would go out to the fields, and they would bring with them some fish to eat or warm water to drink, and then they would massage, their husbands' tired and worn bodies, and then they would be intimate with them in this very strong, ideological move, I would even call it, to continue to want to have children and to believe in a better future, even when they had very little reason to do that. So that idea of these righteous women of Israel, like not giving up, even under the most difficult circumstances, is something that deeply resonates, I think, especially in our time. When I was a kid, or even I would say a young woman, and I heard these stories and I thought even then they were moving, I don't think that I began to understand what it really means to have that kind of courage and that kind of resilience to sustain hope under such awful circumstances. And over the last 2 years during the war here in Israel, we've really seen firsthand so many women who have done so much to keep this country going, even when things were really, really tough. So it could be the soldiers, the women soldiers themselves, who contributed so much to the security and safety of our country in so many different ways. It could be women who volunteered in order to help those who were displaced or those who were injured. Women who stepped up just to be there for their neighbors whose husbands were away and fighting. And then the wives of so many soldiers who really just kept their families functioning and kept their kids healthy and happy and together, totally on their own. And I will say that I was privy also to many young wives who made the very courageous and not at all given decision to decide to become pregnant, even though they knew that their husbands were going to be away for months at a time in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Syria, in various hotspots around Israel. And that decision of we don't know what's going to come. We don't know what's going to, God forbid, happen to our husbands, but we believe in a future, not only for Am Yisrael, but for Am Yisrael in Medina Israel. This is B'zchut Nashim Sidkaniyot. B'zchut Nashim Sidkaniyot, we were Nigalim Mitzrayim. Because of the merit of righteous women, we were redeemed from Egypt. And I want to say B'zchut Nashim Sidkaniyot, the couples and families of our entire nation were really sustained during this really, really tough time in very deep ways. So I think that concept of women being obligated because of Afin Hayu Batonis is something that continues to resonate even in the times that we live in.
Totally. I think we both have that unusual window into women's lives, and it's quite a window to be part of. I just want to also give a shout out to Bat Paro, because she also is important to mention, right? She's not an Israelite woman, but she also plays a very important role.
There's lots of different female characters that connect into the Yetziat Mitzrayim story.
Totally. I think that just if I'm speaking now on a halachic level, I think it's really important to emphasize the fact that women are obligated in Sippur Yetziat Mitzrayim, because the way that the table often functions on seder-night, so women can often find themselves getting up from the table at different times, or whether it's doing something in the kitchen or dealing with the kids, and maybe at a certain point of life to nurse, or maybe to take care of grandchildren who are having a hard time staying awake. And I just want to say, and again, every house functions differently, and different spouses do different things. But I just want to mention that it's important to note that there are certain parts of the Haggada that we really should try and be there for. We're talking now, like, again, on a halachic level of what counts for Sippur Yetziat Mitzrayim. And so just to mention a few elements that are generally thought of to be significant parts of the Haggada that we don't want to miss is Manishtana, is Avadim Hayinu, the 10 plagues, Pesach, Matzah, and Maror, okay, the beginning of Hallel, and the second cup of the wine, including the bracha. And we don't want to miss these pieces. And sometimes it takes a little bit of planning beforehand, right? That comes up all the time. I feel like that's something I often say in these episodes, right? Planning beforehand.
A little bit of thought goes a long way.
Yeah, sometimes waiting also doesn't have to be a big deal. There's a lot of games to play, and in a little while we'll talk about games, meaning we could fill in that time, or a family could try and a little bit organize the time, right? Or maybe it's to take a few minute break to put those, maybe some kids who need to go to sleep, to put them to bed so no one has to be missing it. Again, there's a lot of elements to take into consideration, but this kind of planning can be significant. Maybe sometimes having to do those things more, maybe we'd normally do in a different room, maybe it would be now doing it in the seder room so that everyone can be present. So that's just on that level of trying to make sure that we are there and present for those important parts. And it's also significant to mention that the mitzvah of Sippur Yetziat Mitzrayim applies broadly to every individual. So meaning even if someone is eating alone, they're still obligated, oddly enough, to say the story out loud. That's a unique halacha that we did see being used in Corona, right? Where there were often starim where people, in those one or two, depending on where you're living in the world, starim that people had to be alone. And so we still have to say it out loud. And the mitzvah is learned from the pasuk in Shmot, in Parshat Bo, where we speak about sharing the story and these events with our children. Okay, that you shall tell your son in that day, that is on account of that which God did for me when I went out of Egypt. And so there we have this idea that we have to say the story, have to say it also out loud, and we learn it out from that pasuk. And so that, again, it's not stam that in homes we read the Haggada out loud, right? Meaning we're supposed to be as open and as clear and as sharing as possible on this night. And that is all part of this mitzvah of Sippur Yetziat Mitzrayim.
Right. This isn't something that someone says quietly to themselves or that they read with their eyes. The idea of Sippur is that you're really sharing out loud, even if it's just you.
Nachon. I think, though, another element this really brings up, Shana, and I really want to unpack this with you in this conversation today, is the idea of what it means, what it looks like, and sometimes the challenges of turning our home into a spiritual center. I mean, what do I mean by that? Very often, depending, again, everyone's communities look different, but people look at the shul maybe as a spiritual center, right? Or they look at the Beit Midrash, or we have sort of an outsourcing or these beautiful external spaces where we go and do, right, our frum activities. But what seder-night specifically, as a specific example, but I think is trying to say something broader, is to say the home is the center of spiritual life. Meaning, yes, we also benefit and we're moved and we do those things in those other external spaces. But ultimately, this hitrachashut, this event, right, this interaction is one that's happening inside the home. And it can be really complicated because we have different people with different needs. Maybe there's different children with different needs. We have observant family members. We may have unobservant family members. There's a whole big mix. It's not that self-selecting group that chose to go to that minyan or that self-selecting group who is all studying in that yeshiva. There's something by nature very diverse, even if everyone is living the same lifestyle.
You don't choose your family.
Exactly. So there's something really that's beautiful in theory, and also complex often when it comes to
you don't choose your family, you also don't choose your life circumstances. So, when you have older singles who are coming back to their family for the Seder, or different situations that may be tough emotionally for people, also to find your place and to feel good and to feel like this is a center for my spiritual growth, as opposed to something that you chose, as you're mentioning, is not always simple.
Yeah, and I'll even add another layer to that. There are many people among us who grow up, and sometimes we really journey far from where our family is. And sometimes coming back to that space is simply complicated. It's complicated on an emotional level. It's complicated psychologically.
Find yourself reverting sometimes back into patterns that you thought you outgrew.
Exactly. And
different roles that people go back into.
Totally. And so sometimes, there's both like the nuclear setting of when we're growing up in that home center of what that looks like to make it a spiritual center. And then there's that challenge of coming back to it, especially on a Seder night kind of example, and trying to have this, I would say, this spiritual experience that is supposed to be happening on Seder night. And one other piece that I think is part of the challenge, and we're hopefully going to try and share some ideas that can maybe encourage and strengthen, which is that another element of this is that if we're talking about the home being a center for spiritual life, we're also suggesting that parents are supposed to be spiritual teachers. And that's a whole nother suitcase that we carry around with us. Meaning it's one thing to be, to take care of physical needs and to see the emotional needs of our family members and of our children. But this piece that I'm also supposed to be able to facilitate their growth spiritually, I think is also a really big challenge that often feels very intimidating for parents. And I would also say that sometimes it has to do with either knowledge or their perceived lack of knowledge of what they have to offer. And sometimes it has to do in general with the question of authority, meaning how much does the parent or the parent generation see themselves, or how much are they relevant, right? Authority for those in their home. And that shifts throughout the lifespan. It's going to shift based on who's in that space. And I think that that's also a piece that I just want to lean into, meaning does the parent generation, do they inhabit that role? Is that something they really believe in? Or do they feel like, well, I once was better at that, but now my kids don't actually want that from me? Like that's another piece that I think is...
Or parents who think that their job is to be their kids' friends, you know, and their kids' support, which is also obviously very important, but they don't see themselves in that more authoritarian role, and they don't see themselves as it's their job necessarily to educate, especially if you're sending your kids out to hours and hours of day school education, or you're paying a lot of money for camp. So that idea of like outsourcing their education is also something that, like, what's the balance in terms of what a school or a camp is supposed to give a child versus what we're supposed to be giving them at home. And I think what you're saying is that the Seder night is kind of like forcing everyone to remember that, no, something is supposed to be going on here in the home. The home is supposed to be one of the main centers of spiritual growth or of spiritual activity. And for each family in the way that's going to be right for them. You know, it's not going to look the same. But the very idea that it's supposed to be happening there.
Look, and even with all the outsourcing, which I just have to say, in the life I'm living, I don't feel I have a lot of outsourcing. And I think that there's also big cultural differences in that in different places. Like, also, I feel in general in Israel, the home base is still very overtly the base.
So school is many less hours.
Many less hours. And also, like, okay, we don't build on it. You know, it's okay, it'll be nice if it's good for them. But that's basically the attitude. But one piece I just want to say about that is the fact that no matter where people live in the world, psychologically and blueprint-wise of humans, the home setting is always going to be the most prominent, meaning in terms of the foundational layer creates for people. Sometimes people have to build new layers because that layer wasn't created. But meaning that's not a cultural piece. That's a human piece of the piece of the centrality of the home. I think that it's given more or less emphasis in different cultures. And you're saying it specifically about Orthodox culture, but it's just a human piece that the home is that center. How to make it that spiritual center in addition to being the place where a human grows, right, and germinates is, I think, a very big question.
Yes. And when I think about the topic of education, I try to think about it in a very broad way, because there's a lot of different perspectives or a lot of different angles that we could come at this topic from, because education could absolutely include how parents raise their children, which is what you're referring to. And obviously, it is about how teachers educate and interact with their students, and about how community leaders or rabbis or different people in different roles in the community educate. But I think it also very much relates to how we as adults, think about education and how we frame things even for ourselves, how we educate ourselves, how we approach things, how we grow. So there's so much that we could discuss about this topic, and we could go in a lot of different directions. What I want to do, though, is because this is a Pesach episode, I want to frame the thoughts that we're going to share based on what we could learn about education from the way that the Seder is set up. And I think there's so much there. There's so much that the Torah is telling us just based on this, the Haggada and the way that the seder-night is set up for us. So I want to start by coming back to something that you mentioned a little bit earlier, which is the importance of narrative that you spoke about also on the Hanukkah episode, right? How do we tell our stories to ourselves? How do we tell our stories to others? What parts of the story do we emphasize and what do we kind of like gloss over? The question also of where do we start the story? Like in our minds, where does this story even begin? So when we look at the Haggadah, we could have started from the slavery of Am Yisrael in Egypt, but there are parts of the Haggadah that go back much further. Like we mentioned our avot, we mentioned our forefathers in Canaan, we mentioned the promises that God made to them back then, and then we go well past our redemption from Egypt. Like we talk about coming to Israel, we even mention building the Beit HaMikdash. So we see very much a broadening of the story beyond just the actual freedom element from Egypt. And we speak about our relationship with God and we speak about our ultimate destiny. So there's something very powerful when it comes to storytelling and even the idea of how we tell a story and how we frame it. And Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, in his opening essay in his incredible Pesach Haggada, which I highly recommend, he writes about this, and he writes about how the Seder is so much more than a ritual. He says that the Seder in of itself is an act of remembering and an act of telling the story. And he connects this to the Hebrew word Haggada in a way that is very meaningful. So I just want to share this piece that he writes. He writes, through the Haggada, more than 100 generations of Jews have handed on their story to their children. The word Haggada means relate, tell, expound, but it's closely related to another Hebrew root that means bind, join, connect. So by reciting the Haggadah, Jews give their children a sense of connectedness to Jews throughout the world and to the Jewish people through time. It joins them to a past and future, a history and a destiny, and it makes them characters in its drama. Every other nation known to mankind has been united because its members lived in the same place or spoke the same language or part of the same culture. Jews alone, dispersed across continents, speaking different languages and participating in different cultures, have been bound together by a narrative, this Pesach narrative, which is that they told in the same way, on the same night, the same story. And he ends by saying more than the Haggadah was the story of a people, Jews were the people of a story. And I think a lot about this point, and I think a lot about the stories that we tell ourselves. And as parents and as educators, I try to be very conscious and intentional about like, what stories am I telling my children? What messages or what values do I want to share with them? What do I want to pass on to them? And I'll say that's not always obvious because sometimes we think that like, what do you mean? Like our children will just imbibe it. They'll just absorb it. Like they live with us, you know, or our students hear a lot from us. They'll understand what's important to us. But years ago, Judah and I, when we were struggling with little kids, we went to a parenting therapist, and one of the things that she really impressed upon us that I have really taken with me since then is that she said that don't assume that kids are just absorbing the things that you want them to absorb. If there's something that's important to you, make it clear. Put it into words. Say it to them. And since then, like I think about it in two respects, both in terms of what are the family stories, like what do I want them to know about my upbringing? What do I want them to know about my parents or their grandparents, you know, and their ancestors? The stories of Klal Yisrael, I want them to feel that like they came from somewhere. There's a history here. They didn't just like appear, you know, on this planet. I think that helps kids feel rooted. It gives them a sense of groundedness. It helps them feel secure and nurtured. And it also gives them a sense of purpose and a mission. But I also think about it in terms of practice, not only in terms of history of where they came from, but also in terms of are there rules, are there values, are there practices that are important to them? So in our family, we like to talk a lot about like what are our family values? Like we believe in treating all people with respect. We believe in handling our frustrations, things like that. So those things are very much on my mind. And I'll just add one last thing that also has hit me recently, like very hard, which is the way that stories evolve over time. And the way that something may look now may not be exactly how it looks, you know, at a later point in time. And specifically, I was thinking about it in terms of our aliyah and the fact that now when we talk to our children or we go to any family simcha, you know, it always comes up like now that we're in Israel or look at this, our family's in Israel, like it's part of the narrative and we came from America and now we're here. And I was thinking recently about how, like, in the long arc of our family's story, the fact that there is a blip, literally a blip in time, that some people in this family were in America may not even be something that's relevant. Like, I realized that one day that at least on my father's side, we don't even have one generation that was both born and also died in America. Like, my grandparents were born in Europe and they passed away in America, but my parents, my father and us, me and my sisters, we were born in America, but we're here now in Israel. And, the way that, like, when you look through the Torah and it talks about how the Jewish people were traveling through the Midbar and they stopped here and they stopped here. And, like, no one really cares, like, all the different, I'm like, someone may be like, oh, yeah, and at some point.
Remember Ziza? Yeah, wasn't that a great time?
Point at some, whatever. Maybe at some point there were people that, and it just, I don't know, it's very humbling. Like, it's very humbling to realize, like, oh, the way that we tell the story now may not be exactly the way that our descendants tell the story. And then it got me thinking about, like, that bigger story, because really at the end of the day, we're part of a much bigger story, the story of Am Yisrael, and that's also, like, when we talk about the 4 cups of wine and we talk about the Arba Lishonot Kula, these 4 languages of redemption, and and then we say that, okay, Hashem, he took us out and he saved us and he redeemed us. And then the last cup is Veheviti, that 5th cup, the Kosh Eliyahu. He brought us to Israel. So I'm like, okay, so, right. So it's kind of like maybe the ends that matters and where we were. I don't know, just a lot of thoughts about storytelling and what we emphasize, because I think it matters.
I think that the idea about the shifting story is the reason why the Pesach Haggada became solidified in the way it is. Meaning, I think throughout because it's a Haggada that developed over generations, and the story develops. It's fascinating if anyone wants to really look into that idea about, like, the way that different pieces came together. But I think that it's solidified into something, and it hasn't been changed for many millennia, because there's a recognition that if we wanted, we can keep changing the story, but sometimes we need to, like, kind of like close the book on the way the story is told, and then we'll have other moments to tell other stories. And I think that piece really comes through, because sometimes we can look at the Haggada and be like, I don't know, maybe all the dress show, it's about the numbers, like maybe we would have chosen something different, or we don't choose anything from Shmo, we choose it all from Dvarim, where it's recounting what was in the past. And I think that there's a decision, not a decision by one person, but there's been a decision throughout centuries that basically said, we need uniformity in this story, and we need this to be our
backbone.
It's our birth story, right? We need that to stay the same, because yes, stories do change over time, and what was important once is not important now, but these are pieces we want to be important forever. So I think that really speaks to that point you're making. I also, when you were speaking about the importance of stories and the fact that it anchors people within their family, I was remembering this research. I think I was exposed to it like many, many, many years ago, but apparently it's an ongoing lab. It's in Emory University. It's called the Family Narratives Lab, which explores the different ways that family reminisce about their history. And it's a research project, and it really indicates exactly what you just said, that the more that a child is aware of their family history and anchored in their stories and knows their grandparents, and they will have higher self-esteem and stronger resilience and better coping skills and a greater sense of control over life. And they call it the intergenerational self, right? Is basically that we can place ourselves in a broader supportive network. Now, I'll just say, if I've already was mentioning the broader world earlier in the episode, that being in a family setting, again, wherever we stand in that family, there's something about this that feels obvious. But of course, in the broader world today, where many people don't even know who their parents are or one of their parents are, this is critical information. And to remind everyone, I think that, again, in a traditional Jewish life, it's the air we breathe, so to speak. But I think that it still has a tremendous message that
really,
the world needs.
What you're talking about is a rootedness that's so strong. And we know, like, even the deeper the roots are of a tree, the stronger it's going to be. So the more grounded you feel, the more secure you are.
Another piece that's important, and it connects that security, is that what they also find is that the more that a child has heard about stories of we weathered that storm, there were ups and downs, exactly what we say in the Haggada, right? Meaning, B'tchila, we were worshipers of Avodah Zarah, right? Those were our humble beginnings. But we were able to get through it. And then there was Paro, who came up against us, but we were able to come out of that situation. Meaning, the more that a child dafka hears, meaning not to cover up the stories of struggle that were. They when they know that their previous generations were able to have resilience, they themselves are able to lean into that kind of resilience
themselves.
Like
in Israel, people like to say, Arvanu at Paro, Navor Gametzeh. Like, we survived Paro, we got through that, we'll get through whatever stands before us.
Exactly. A nice little trance song by Yishai Ribo there. So I think that piece is also just to give that even more layers in terms of that research. I'll just say personally, Shayna, that this is something I struggle with very much. I'm not a natural storyteller. By the way, my students tell me this is not true, but here's where I'll be really personal for a moment. My father, alav shalom, he also had this little bit of this dichotomy in him where outside of his home, he would be like very talkative and very chatty. And inside the home, there was something much more demure about him. And I am very similar. I wouldn't say I'm demure, but meaning I'm not, I can easily not speak. Like I'm a doer. I'll do the things in the home.
See you in your home.
I know. But it's like, it's a muscle that I try and build. And if I already mentioned my father, I want to say specifically about that, meaning I know that for me, whatever my children will know about my father will only be from the stories I tell them because they'll never have known him. And so I really feel that responsibility and I'm not good at it. Like I'm not good at telling those stories. Thankfully, I'm married to someone who is much better at telling stories, but like to be able to have that, like, the family lore or the things that we talk about. So I just am not naturally inclined to do that. So it's something I really think about the stories that, that we want to have in this home. And that point about if something is important to you, then say it openly. So that one I'm pretty good at. That one I'm okay with, right? What is your values? Speak it out loud until they can basically, say it in their sleep.
But Seder time could be like a great time to talk about these things. Like, yes, also Yetziat Mitzrayim, but also family stories or family values. It's part of the bigger story.
Totally. So I think that it's also just, again, through the prism of the Seder, it's a really good reminder that that it's important to tell the stories, but the point you're saying, which is a second level, which is sometimes we need to think about the fact that the story has shifted and we may want to shift the way we tell that story, or it's no longer helpful to tell it in that way, right? So there's like another added layer to that as we continue on.
Yeah. I think also like when we think about the Seder, part of what we're trying to do in telling these stories is to like bring all the people that are at the Seder into it. And it's interesting that the way that we do that is by really trying to hear the questions that are in people's minds, right? So the same way that if all of a sudden someone in the family asks, hey, I never really knew anything about grandma's life, and you're like, oh, okay, this is an opportunity. So a little bit at the Seder, we're also trying to get people to pay attention, like, what questions do you have? So as adults, what questions are on our minds, but also for the children, like, what questions do they have? And then even trying to pique their curiosity to get them to be noticing things and to asking things. And we know one of the earliest sections of the Seder is Manishtana, which is the 4 questions. And I think it's amazing that even though we just said that a big part of the Seder is this story, we don't just launch into the story. Like we would think, okay, here we are at the Seder, everyone's present, let's go, let's start with the story. And we don't do that. And even somebody who's totally alone at the Seder doesn't just start telling the story. They have to first ask questions. So this idea of taking a minute to be like, where are we? What questions are on our mind? What are we noticing? To engage in a dialogue, to give room to people, to give space, to really see them and to acknowledge what are the things that maybe they're wondering about or what are the things that they want to hear about, so then we could target the way that we tell the story to them, I think is something that the Torah is telling us that whether you're a parent and you're involved in raising a child, whether you're an educator and you're thinking about students, whether you're just a group of adults and you want people to feel seen, this idea of empowering people by giving them the self-confidence to raise their questions and to make them understand that you care about what they have to say is something huge and is a huge tool in enabling us to become lifelong independent thinkers who are curious about the world, who pay attention to the things that we're thinking about and that bother us. And I think it's amazing that at the Seder, we give room to children to ask questions and we tell them we want to hear your questions, and we do things on purpose to get them to ask questions. Like we change things up a little bit so that they'll notice things and they'll ask about it. And then it enables the answers to be more internalized, because when something is not just being put onto you or thrown at you, or you're not just being spoken to, but you actually ask, it makes you more interested in the answer because you actually are curious.
Yeah, I think that it also speaks really directly to the question of how the Seder is led. I think that some of us might have grown up in a space or are still participating in a space where there's like a leader. That leader might be the father or the grandfather or the uncle or whoever it is. And I think that if I'm just sharing a perspective on this, again, if that works for someone, I think that that's beautiful. But I really look at the seder night as something, and it connects this idea of people feeling that they actually have space to say things. Because when you have the leader, then you have the model of like, well, I wrote all the Divrei Torah and I'm going to say it and I'm going to show, because there's something very hierarchical about that. And therefore, when I share, it's to share to show that I too can be hierarchical a bit in that situation. And I think that what I really appreciate is that when a seder is kind of moderated. Now, I'm not only saying that because I like podcasting, right? But I believe in it also as a shita chinuchit, like as an educational method, because what that means is that there is someone who orchestrates, right? Or let's even, again, be very practical. In the way that our seder functions, there is always a lot of thought put into how the table is physically set up, how it looks. I'm not such a creative person, I think, but I do a lot of creative, like setting up scenes and setting up Yam Suf and putting out, Playmobil pieces and decorating the entrance to the house. And so like having the table itself be something that like invites an experience. And actually, yes, placing people in certain places so that like there is something strategic. I'm not like that in a regular Shabbat at all, but like that there's a strategic way that everyone's sitting. And also having tools that enable a natural flow of sharing that are not based only on one person. Now, again, if we're talking about reading and that not everybody can read, that's understandable, but meaning that there's a moderating element. So like we have a game, and I'm happy to include a link to this in the show notes, that they've been selling actually for the past few years around where I live. I ordered it online before I saw it in the stores, but it's basically like a runner, right, that you put on the table. The runner is divided up into different parts of the Haggada, and so what we do in our home is that each time we get to another part, somebody else rolls the die, and then they pick up a card. And there's 4 different kinds of cards. Some of them are open questions, like the curious questions we spoke about. Some of them have an action. One of them are a game, and it's like a really, really easy way that like everybody can get involved. It doesn't rely on anyone's like knowledge. It's a very democratic game in that way, but it also just makes it flow. So you also have the people reading, but you also each turn have another person at the Seder who's taking part in what's happening.
And who's sharing.
And who's sharing something. It really keeps everyone involved. And it also moves it away from this, like, one person is moderating. So yes, okay, so I'm keeping track of who did what, and there's games that were planned before, but there's something more democratic about it, and I really do feel that. And then there's like this natural flow of like, well, they want to also say a Dvar Torah that they prepared, and they want to share a thought, and there's something about like that like game structure. It's not make fun of. It still has like, it's a serious game, but it's also very sweet, and there also are cute little funny things. And I also say that if I can give a shout out, if that's okay, to Sari Kopitnikoff, who's unbelievable, and her website is called That Jewish Moment, and she has amazing Seder games that I've used. I had to run a few Starim in English a few years ago because the games we have are in Hebrew, and I used her materials. You can find them online. You can also buy them. Highly recommend it. They're really, really easy to use. You can print them out at home, and I've also used that in English, and it's phenomenal.
That's great. I really, really like that idea. I'll share that very recently, my family and I spent Shabbat in Migdal Uz at a Bogud Shabbaton, and all these alumni of Migdal Uz who have made Aliyah and are living here, and they came back with spouses and children and a whole huge range of ages. And one of the things that my kids who were there were commenting on was that they're like, Ima, like you've gotten, good at this rule of like where you give a prompt, but then like you kind of step back and people just speak and they comment and they respond to each other. And that idea of like that the educator or the parent doesn't necessarily have to be doing frontal teaching. That's one way of educating, and that's important obviously in many circumstances or in different contexts, but that another way of facilitating education is to, as you said, to moderate or to prompt or to kind of open things up, but then to actually let the participants like really have a place.
Yeah, I just want to give a shout out. It's also a skill that I totally learned in Migdal Oz, and it's very characteristic of a lot of the learning that goes on there. And it's been very interesting to take that skill and bring it into other spaces where people are not as used to it. And the results are awesome.
Yes, very awesome. Like we spoke about this on Hanukkah, like doing a sevev and throwing out a question, all things that I learned and Migdal Oz and are very, very, very powerful. I think also this idea that like the Seder doesn't have to be a competition of Divrei Torah, like who has the best Dvar Torah, who has the most complex nuanced Dvar Torah, the most sophisticated Dvar Torah, the longest Dvar Torah. It doesn't have to be that. It also doesn't have to be different kids vying for attention, that every kid has to share their notebook of what they brought home. It's great to be able to kind of level the playing field a little bit and to make room for different kinds of things. So Divrei Torah are wonderful, but also singing is wonderful, or skits, or a game, or different creative things, particularly because different people also learn and connect in different ways. And that's one of the lessons of the Arba Banin, that when we speak about the 4 sons that we discuss at the Seder, I think there, what the Torah is telling us, or what we're supposed to take away from the Haggada, is that how we talk to people and how we educate, not just what we say, but how we say it, is crucial. How we approach a different person, based on what their needs are, their personality, what it is that they're really asking. Each time we say, Chacham ma hu omer, meaning what is this particular child saying? What's bothering him? What's on her mind? What should we be noticing? Oftentimes, the most effective and appropriate ways to convey our message are the ways that are going to really take into account, like how I'm going to respond, how is it going to land? How is this particular individual going to hear this? How are they going to process it? Because one person may hear something that I say and it learns perfectly well and they, integrate it into who they are. Whereas someone else, we're like, no, but they're sensitive about that, or that's not going to work for them. And then I have to take the same material, it's maybe the same content, but I have to think about how I'm going to present it. And basically the Haggada is telling us, put the listener at the center of the experience. It's not about us right now. It's not about who's telling the story. It's also about who's hearing the story. And I think in our home, we've tried especially to do this around what's supposed to be the main part of the Haggada, which is the psukim of Arami Oved Avi, which come from Dvarim, which are psukim that have to do with our experience in Mitzrayim, where we expound in the psukim and we add different midrashim and we talk about them. And it's often a part that people rush through because it's like a little bit more text, a little bit more boring. There's no songs there. But we've tried to think, how can we make this part come alive for the people at our Seder this year? So one year we gave out the psukim beforehand, and everyone drew a picture related to that pasuk, and then we hung them at the Seder, and then everyone explained what they drew at the Seder. Or somebody could make a comic, or somebody could prepare a skit, or someone could prepare a Dvar Torah on the pasuk that they were given. But how, again, could we take some of the really meat and potatoes part of the Seder and convey it in a way that is going to speak to the people there? And I think that's a huge part of respecting others in life, is understanding that not everybody thinks the same, not everybody learns the same ways, not everybody grows from the same things. It's going to look different for different people. Having that kind of humility and patience, especially as parents, allows us to see our children as individuals, which I will not say is easy, because as parents, a lot of times we have ideas of how we want things to look and how we want our kids to be and how we want them to turn out, so to speak, whether it's in terms of their personalities, their character traits, their religious growth, to be able to take a step back and say, wait a second, am I just imposing my thoughts and ideas and perspectives on them, or am I able to see them, what their strengths are, what their limitations are? That's not a simple thing at all, but the more that we're able to do that, and I think the Haggada is encouraging us to do that just by having this section of the Arba Banim and acknowledging that different kids are different, helps us to better accept the people that are close to us in our lives and to think carefully about what's going to be best for them.
I think that tension point, or that meeting point between wanting to pass something on versus seeing the actual people that are in front of us, I think that is the summary of the challenge of being the educator parent, right? You don't have the privilege of just seeing what you want to happen. I don't think teachers anymore I think teachers also realize that today, that you have to realize where it lands. But there's a real tension there, because on one hand, you do need to have a purpose. You need to have a mission that you kind of want to put out there.
A lesson plan.
Or a lesson plan. On the other hand, you have to deal with the human material that's in front of you. And it's a really big challenge. It's a challenge on a daily level within any kind of home structure. Of course, it also has a challenge in the classroom. So I think that really kind of summarizes the challenge that exists. I think if I could add one other piece, though, about the Arba Banim, is this piece about the Rasha, right? There's something every year new, I feel like have like a more like a inner pinch right inside when you hear the word Rasha. And I think it's been jarring for people for many millennia already. I don't think that this is a new or modern piece. And many, of course, have asked, like, what about this child in what's described about them makes them the Rasha? I mean, it doesn't sound like something so terrible.
Like, what makes them evil?
Yeah,
Really, like,
it's a very strong word. And I would say, like, even its initial context in Tanakh, Rasha is a strong word. It's not like we could say, oh, well, once Rasha meant not so great. No, Rasha meant someone who rejects all. That's what it meant in Tehillim especially. And so, again, there are multiple explanations that have been offered, but I think the Rambam here, and he writes about this in Hilchot Tshuva in the 3rd chapter. So, and again, I think often this is an interpretation that gets quoted. He says, what's the issue? Lefi she'hotzi et atzmo me'aklal, right? Because in the question, he asks about what is for you as opposed to about for us. Somebody who pulls himself away from the community, even though he didn't do any averot, meaning he still fulfills mitzvot, right? This is not even someone who is not fulfilling mitzvot anymore. It's not a child who's rejected, right, the ways of the family. But אלא נבדל מעדת ישראל ואינו עושה מצוות בכללן ולא נכנס בצרתן ולא מתענה בתעניתן, right? He doesn't see himself a part of it. He doesn't maybe even fast with their fast. Here it's speaking about when there's a tzara, right? And he doesn't take part in what the community is going through. אלא הולך בדרכו כאחד מגויי הארץ וכאילו אינו מהן, אין לו חלק לעולם הבא. Very strong phrasing. He doesn't have a part in the world to come, and it's like as if he's basically become a goy, meaning he's no longer part of.
He's removed himself from the klal. He's removed himself from the tzibur, from the community. That's the focus here.
Exactly.
Not the specific prohibitions that he, is.
But even so, Shana, it's a very, very, very strong formulation. But I think that the idea that is being suggested here is that deciding to not belong to the Jewish people is not an option, meaning belonging is the thing here, right?
And that's
so
the given.
It's the given. And it's not even about necessarily what mitzvot someone is performing or not performing. But this is a night where we remember that this is a brit, and we don't get an option to opt out of that brit. Mm-hmm. We might have an option about how we perform, right? Or what that looks like.
Right. Do we live up to the expectations of that brit and the standards? But are we a part of that covenantal Judaism? Yes, you are.
We are part of it, and that we are part of its Sippur. And stepping outside of that, even in like a nuanced linguistic way, is devastating, I think, suggests the piece about the Rasha. Now, I do want to say one other thing, though, because I think that is sort of in the specific context of the Haggada. But if we do pull back for a minute and we do think about this idea of the 4 children and the fact that we have one child who steps outside, I think that obviously the idea is very resonant for so many families, right? Even, yes, if there are children who decide not to follow the ways of the family, whether in their life choices, in their religious choices, and this piece about the fact that, everybody still is part of the table, has a seat at the table. And the fact that we all have to make space for all of them, I think it's so hard for the parents and it's so hard for the children, meaning it's so hard to be that child who has pulled back or pulled away, and it's really hard to be that parent but this is a night where everybody sits at that table again, like that. We have to figure out how to make a space for everybody.
Rasha in the Haggada is still there.
Exactly. He's at that table and he's speaking his mind. He's not quiet. And I think that is just a challenge that so many people on Seder night are going to look around their table, and whether from the perspective of the grown child at the table or the perspective of the parents. And it's this moment where you say, this is who we are, right? This is who we have. We're all part of this covenant. And yes, people have made choices at this table about the way that they respect or make space for that covenant in their life. And it's not simple, but we're all sitting at this table and still going through this experience together.
And I think just actually taking a moment to appreciate the fact that everyone is at the table is huge. The Lubavitcher Rebbe talks about how there's a 5th child, the child that doesn't even come. And how, Chabad and the Lubavitcher Rebbe was very into finding that child and trying to bring them back and to relate to them and to just accept them wherever they're at, to see them. So take him in and be like, right, it could be that this is a complicated group of people and that not everyone at this table is in exactly the same place, or that this isn't how we imagine things, not as parents or not as grown children, but the fact that we're all here together is something that I think that a family can take a moment to appreciate. And in general, that ties into the fact that I think today in parenting, we try more to focus on accentuating what is there, like to see what is there as opposed to always thinking only about what's lacking or what's missing. And that reminds me a little bit of Dayenu. When we get to the Dayenu part, which everyone just thinks is like a fun song, but in Dayenu, if you think about what's going on there, we break down each piece of our redemption and we basically focus on that specific little thing. And we say that thing on its own would have been enough to recognize, enough to thank God for, enough to appreciate, enough to be grateful, even if it wasn't everything that we are hoping for. And I think the fact that the Haggada is telling us we could have real appreciation, deep appreciation for each little thing, each step of a, process in this case, even if it's not the entire thing, also could help us then be able to appreciate each part of a person or each strength that they have or each quality or each thing that we do love about them, even if in the end, like the picture isn't exactly what we always imagine. So I think that's very relevant to parents and to a lot of Seder tables that people are going to be engaging in.
Totally. And sometimes just breaking down that big picture into smaller pieces is like the key to being able to just like move a step forward, right? And not being overwhelmed by, by that big picture, which sometimes doesn't exactly look the way that we thought it was going to.
But then you really are able to often find things the same way that we've spoken about on this podcast about, like the mindfulness that today is so in vogue, or like people having gratitude journals you spoke about at some point, like being able to say, I'm happy for this. Yeah, my day as a whole was really awful, but like this one specific thing I'm grateful for. So Dayenu highlights that.
And I think, and by the way, it also connects back to this piece about how we frame the narrative, meaning it's framing the narrative as one of gratitude. And I think that that's so important. I want to share an idea about the Eser HaMakot, the 10 plagues, which really speaks to me, definitely in my Tanakh background specifically. But I think that it itself also, in the broader scheme of what it might encourage us to ask, I think is also significant. The plagues, there are multiple levels to what they accomplish, but I want to just look at two. The first is the way that the 10 plagues kind of speak back or in dialogue with the creation of the world. The plagues essentially destroy Egypt. We'll talk in a minute about they also totally dismantle like the order of the universe that the Egyptians had created. But in the same way that God like gradually created the world in the first chapter of Bereshit, right? We had the different levels. We had the water and we had the dry land, and then we had the different, right? We had the different, we had the grass and vegetation, and we had the birds and the fish, and we have the creepy crawly creatures, and we have humans, we have animals, and then humans. So if you look carefully at the 10 plagues, we have like a dismantling of all of those elements of creation, whether the atmospheric elements, the animals, right? All the different elements that exist here, and the final one, which obviously takes down humans to a certain degree. And what we have here is the fact that sort of God comes to Egypt, this very, again, put together, unbelievable, powerful society, and basically says, I'm going to take you down layer by layer, and I'm going to create utter chaos. I'm going to bring Egypt back to almost a tohu vavohu. And what is going to come out of that, what's going to emerge out of that is Am Yisrael, meaning I'm going to take from that, just like we kind of had like the creation of man, that is the pinnacle of the creation and the creation story in Bereshit Aleph. So here we sort of leave Egypt as tohu vavohu, and we have humanity emerging. And now we're going to now recreate basically our own atmosphere and world when we leave that place. And it really also just, again, it's like this very overt vanquishing. And I also just want to suggest, if I can give a name to associate with this, we have really beautiful articles by Professor Joshua Berman, who also writes about this, and many others. And we have, again, all the elements of the world that get taken down through the Makot. The other piece that's significant about this is sort of bringing Egypt to their knees and bringing them to chaos, is essentially to make the very clear point that only God controls all these elements, meaning Egypt had taken credit for a lot of these elements in the universe and had assigned all of their own gods as well. In a minute, we'll talk about that. But the fact that the water, the earth, the living creatures, heavens, and the sun itself, that all of these are under God's jurisdiction. And so it's very overtly taking them out of the control of the Egyptian sorcerers and of Paro himself, and reminding them, right, v'yadatem et Hashem, meaning that becomes an overt that they will know God, right, the capital G God. That is one of the overt goals of the Egypt experience.
Right. And that's why the connection back to the creation story is so powerful, because it's like God created this and us remains God. It's not like he just put it into motion. He's still here and he's still calling the shots.
Exactly, and getting involved in the daily ongoings of life. The other side of these makot that I think are also really significant is really like the theological side. And I just want to give a few examples and again, you can look this up. There are many articles that write about this on the that are accessible on the internet. But the idea that each of the makot represents an overt polemic with one of the Egyptian small g gods is also very overt. Even just looking at the first, right, of the makah that's on the Nile, that you have the Nile, which they thought of as a god, and obviously which was used to bring harm to the Jewish boys, as you had mentioned earlier. But that sort of goes awry and that it's no longer in control. And the fact that we have kind of like also really a destruction of that very strong life force is very significant. And you have, there are specific gods that are associated with it. We have Heket, which is like the frog goddess of fertility and birth, which is also very clearly being polemicized in the second Makkah. And there, again, in every single Makkah, we could look at that each one kind of, again, dismantles an element of the Egyptian pantheon.
You're saying it's not just that strengthening God's presence in the world, at the same time it's also destroying
a very specific associated power in the Egyptian world. And even darkness, right? Ra, which was the sun god, and Paro was thought to also be the divine and the son of Ra. So in the 9th plague, we have darkness, which basically says you're not in charge of the light here, right? That's not a power that has been divvied up to other sources. And also in the death of the firstborn, right? Meaning again, the human damage that's being wrought here by God. And I think that this piece, again, there are many, many other elements, and I find it really, really fascinating. First of all, it's also directly spoken in Shemot, Perek Yud Bet, Pasuk Yud Bet in 12:12. It says, Ubechol Elohei Mitzrayim Eseh Shvatim, right? I am going to bring punishment upon all of the gods of Egypt, meaning God says this outright. The fact that it doesn't mention the small g gods and all of the plagues, it's also because it was clearly overt, meaning people understood to a certain degree, as did Pharaoh.
That's what they experienced.
That's what they experienced it. It was very clear to them. Well, what happened? My small g God, it controls all of these things. So how is it possible that it's going awry? And so all of that, again, it's like that sense, I would even say just the darkest one. It's like right when the electricity or you have a blackout and all of a sudden you're like, the thing you thought was controlling things is no longer there. And so it's just much this dismantling of those powers. And I think that this idea is powerful even for now, because I think that this question of, I'm going to go back to this idea of the polemic. And I think this also could be like an open question that we think about at the Seder, which is that what are the things that we are doing right now that are countercultural to a certain degree? Maybe it's not a polemic. I'm not trying to bring something down, but there's a lot about our lives as, I would say, traditional and also observant Jews that is taking issue with a lot of what's going on in the world right now. And that we are in a lot of internal and communal dialogues with how we're supposed to be in communication with those ideas. It's always been true, always. It is always a question we can ask ourselves. And I think that now there are many questions. There has been a lot of questioning of basic assumptions in the world, right? About how humans are supposed to function, male, female, a lot of questions out there that I think that, yes, traditional lifestyle is still really in dialogue and trying to figure out, where do we stand in relation to this? And I think that it's not just about, the old world and pantheons and sort of idol worship. It's a question about where do we stand vis-a-vis the culture that we're part of? And are there things that we want to kind of dismantle, even if it's really gentle? Or are there elements of it where we say that, no, well, that's a part that comes in and can be part of our lifestyle?
Meaning the makot don't have to only be understood in their physical, literal sense. Like we could think about what are the things that we today kind of use? What are the tools that we have to dismantle like the world order that doesn't resonate with us?
Yeah.
So powerful. I want to respond to that in a minute. As you're speaking, I'm thinking about, I read over this the past year this novel that's this historical fiction that takes place in Egypt during the time of the Geula.
What's it called, Shannon? I love a good book recommendation.
Okay, no, but it's not like the highest literature. It was written like in Hebrew, and my sister in Ramat Eshkol was like, you have to read this because it's going to change your entire experience of Pesach. And I hadn't thought about it because I read it like in the summer. And now as you're describing the Makkah, I'm like, wow, I'm back there, because it makes it so real. Like you're in the experience as like Egypt is, kind of falling apart, and the Jewish people are having their experience in Goshen. And like all of a sudden I realized, like, yes, it actually really had an impact on me, because when we learn about these stories, especially as kids, it's very hard to then like come back to them and think about them as adults. Like, what did this really mean for this world order of Egypt, which was the superpower of the time, to slowly be dismantled? And the book made it like very, very, very alive for me. But the question that you are asking right now about like, how do we respond to a culture that is very different than the values that we believe in? So first of all, it ties right into the Midrash that says that Bnei Israel were mitzuyanim sham, that Bnei Israel in Mitzrayim, in Egypt, they were identifiable as Jews, that even though they had really, really, really like fallen to the lowest levels of idol worship and were completely influenced by the culture, they still were able to maintain their distinct Jewish identity through their Jewish names and through their clothing, which like made them identifiable as Jews. So just on that very concrete level of like how they saw themselves, even though their practice was very far from like a Torah lifestyle or whatever, it is first of all important in terms of like that counterbalance, like sometimes the very concrete things of like, do we have Jewish names? Do we dress in a way that identifies us? Does someone see, the kippah on the street and be like, that's a Jew or whatever? So that's the first thing that I was thinking about as you said this, and the connection to that. The Jews, even before, the Makot or any of this, they kind of managed in their own way to kind of fight against this very, very strong culture, even as it very, very much influenced them. But what popped up for me as you were speaking, I would say two things. One, you a little bit touched on earlier when you were talking about just the focus on family and the focus on children and the focus on education. Like, we know that we're living in a world where it's not very much about family anymore, and it's not about, putting ourselves out there for other people. It's very much a society that's focused on the individual, and that's focused on autonomy, and that's focused on like, you do you. And already the idea that we're sitting at a family seder and we're focused on passing something on to another generation, and we're having intergenerational dialogue, because there's usually oftentimes even 3 generations could be, or 4 generations sometimes even could be present at a seder, I think is a big part of like our response to the culture around us. And the second thing, which is connected to that in a broader sense, is the really big underlying value of commitment, of submission, of being ready to be moser nefesh, to sacrifice for things that are greater than ourselves, to think outside of just what's good for me, and to be connected to something bigger than us. And I think that in a world that very much focuses, again, on like instant gratification or on what feels good for me, and by the way, it's a language that I appreciate. Like, I'm happy that we're living in a generation that wants people to be more self-aware and to know like when something is violating to them. Like, those are good things. I'm not knocking that. Like, it's very important that and I want my children also to be like aware of what works for them and what doesn't work for them. But at the same time, I also want them to know how to push themselves beyond themselves, or to work hard for something, or to be committed to something that's greater than them, to have values and ideals and priorities that are more than just, what feels good for them right now. And when I think about that idea, and I think about what it means, like, how do we help our children? How do we help ourselves? When we're talking about ourselves, how do we help ourselves break out of mindsets that are so pervasive in the world that we live in? So the Haggada, or the Torah, has a tip for us, which is that we know that there's so many little details that have to do with the Karban Pesach. Like, so many of the 613 mitzvot are actually devoted to the different aspects of the Karban Pesach. And the Sefer HaChinuch, which is a sefer that goes through the 613 mitzvot from the Torah and tries to give reasons and explanations and discuss each one and where it comes from. And it's a sefer, I'll just say as an aside, that I feel connected to because I learned it with my father, together with him before my bat mitzvah. And in there, in the 16th mitzvah, in mitzvah Tet Zayin, which is the mitzvah of not breaking a bone when you eat the Karban Pesach, which is like, really? Like, what? I'm eating this Paschal lamb that we sacrificed earlier in the day and this big family gathering. I'm like, why do you care? Like, if I break a bone as I'm eating it? So Sefer Chinuch writes that the whole idea here is that when we need to instill certain mindsets in ourselves, especially if they're different from the culture around us or from a previous mindset, they were very steeped. So the way that we could best do that is through all different kinds of little small actions. And he says here, the Jewish people were slaves and they were deep in a slave mentality, and slaves don't get to choose when they eat or how they eat or what they're eating. And he says the fact that here, when they're eating, we're telling them you're royalty. Like, you don't need to eat in this way that you have to break the bones and suck out all the marrow and make sure that you don't like miss any little thing or whatever. Like, you have the ability to be free people and to eat benachad and to kind of eat with a sense of just tranquility and a serene mentality. He says that was really, really, really important in terms of affecting the way that they thought about themselves. He calls this principle acharei hapulot nimshachim halevavot, that our heart is drawn after our actions, that who we are at the end of the day is most influenced by the things that we do. So I think about the Seder as being like it's very physical. It's very concrete. You know, I remember in earlier episodes you spoke about I knew like physical, concrete things, actions, and that's the Seder. Like, there's a lot. There's the eating, and there's the washing the hands, and there's the dipping, and there's and in Sephardi Seders they also like they put things on there, like they act as if they were slaves, and all these things. We make it very, very real, and I think that very much jives with the research that's done in the field of psychology that shows us that often it's actions that give rise to attitudes and help us really feel connected to things. Sometimes you think, oh, if I want to change my perspective, if I want to change the way that I act, so I need to like really read up on this and I need to research it and I need to learn about it. And it's like, no, actually just start doing it. Like, sometimes just starting to do something is much more effective than even the most persuasive argument, which also fits with the idea that we know in Judaism of mitosh shelo lishma balishma, that sometimes if you start doing something, even if not with the best, reasons or the most pure motivation, sometimes you're actually going to get to a place where, no, you actually really believe in this thing. And I think the laws of Karban Pesach were part of this initial push that you're talking about to break the Jews out of the culture that they were steeped in. So we have like the Mako, which is breaking down that world order and breaking down the dependence that they felt on the Egyptian gods. But we also have the little actions at the end of the day, which are going to very much help them develop new attitudes and approaches.
Totally. No, I think that that's really, really important. And I think that it's another way of framing it similarly. But when I remember last year I was teaching the book of Shemot for the first time, really from start to finish. And I was noticing that, first of all, as you said, there are so many details that really like relegate the Korban Pesach way more than other korbanot that we have. And it has all these different elements in it. It has sensitivity to time. It has to be ben harbaim. It has like food specifics, right? Which is about like, again, what you're supposed to bring, how you're supposed to bring. It has rules about who's supposed to eat it. It's supposed to be eaten within a family, meaning it removes it from the mikdash setting, which of course is very, very reminiscent of what we're doing on seder-night. And then essentially it like the home turns almost into like a mini mikdash.
Yeah, which goes back to your point about being a spiritual center.
Exactly. And we talk even about like, what's the mood supposed to be? You're supposed to eat it b'chipazon, right? Meaning it's not just like eat it with your people. Meaning it's eat it with your people in a very specific kind of way. Obviously, again, it's different Pesach Mitzrayim and Pesach Ledorot and the initial Pesach Korban and the ones that come later. But one other thing that's also been mentioned by many is this idea that like it's not supposed to have any seasoning, right? It's supposed to be, it's almost like a frugal meal. I mean, there's a lot of meat, but it's not supposed to have accoutrements with it.
Simple.
It's simple. And I believe it, I saw this in Leon Kass's commentary on the book of Shemot, where he says that this really relates to the idea of like leaving the materialism of Egypt behind, meaning the idea that we don't want all those accoutrements. We want it to just be something that's like gets us down to the core. And I want to say two things on this. One is that I almost feel like I know that Rosh Chodesh was the first mitzvah that we got, but their first mitzvah as a group is going to be Korban Pesach. And Korban Pesach, I feel, is kind of like a boot camp into like everything that the Torah is. Kedusha in Zman, right? About all these different rules of kashrut. And the fact that, right, it's supposed to be within the family. And yes, the priests have a very important function, but that's not like the main point right now. Questions, again, many elements of kashrut about how to cook it. And the fact that, as you said, yes, our home is supposed to be something that has a value to it, that it has a certain simplicity. And I'll also just say that other than the fact that the Korban Pesach is kind of like this boot camp into what the Torah is going to be and what they're going to receive, is that something I often come back to is that, and this just want to say one word to the whole concept of like Pesach preparation that I know makes many people out there nervous, is that to me, Pesach brings us back. It kind of strips away many layers of how we behave or behaviors we indulge in throughout the year. And kind of, I think of it often as like an acoustic version of a song versus like the full produced version. Meaning, what do I mean by that? We're not supposed to be basically eating a lot of different kinds of carbohydrates. Just saying that. We're taking away that chametz of like the thing that is processed, okay? And it's bringing us back to,
that's
right?
The basics.
Pesach is supposed to be proteins and vegetables, essentially, right? And if you're Sephardi, so you get a whole great, option of legumes out there. But it's bringing our food choices back to something that's like supposed to be pretty simple. And in theory, also something that's very healthy. And also this piece about like, clear out your home of the things that kind of no longer serve you. I know that that's more of like a spiritual way of looking at cleaning for Pesach, but there's not that much food usually hanging out in a lot of different corners, but Pesach often calls us to say like, what in this home is kind of like that chametz? Again, there's so many Hasidic ideas about that say this exact same thing, but like pull back those things that like, we don't need it. It's just like extra. It's not really who we are. It's like these layers that we've added to ourselves.
Right. Or chametz being the bread that like rose, right? The dough that rose, like something extra.
For some, it's the chata'im, okay? Sometimes it's the chata'im as often gets depicted. But I just often look at it as like layers that like don't need to be there anymore. And that for me is also just like a really meaningful part. And I try and think about that when I think about the cleaning and the food, as opposed to being like, oh, this is so horrible and it makes me have to do a lot of changes. So also it depends on what kind of food a home normally eats, whether or not Pesach really demands that many changes of them. But this piece about like, it's a chag that says pull back the layers that are not really like the main bit of who we are. And for me, that often has like a very redeeming element to the preparation that comes beforehand.
I think some people thought that they tapped into that idea, that first Pesach on COVID, right?
Yeah.
Like during COVID, where it was like people who usually go away or have huge seders or whatever, like it was kind of like this very basic, very simple, just our family. It was very hard Pesach, obviously, for a lot of people, but there was something of like, we're just like cutting to the chase of like, what is this about? And it's an important exercise to go through or to ask ourselves sometimes. All right. There's a lot of ideas that we touched on here, and my head is kind of spinning and thinking about a lot of different things. And I feel like there's so much more that we could go into, or more depth in terms of the things that we already raised. What's your takeaway? Where are you?
Okay, as Kidder Kiba Kodesh, I want to say something on like the more practical side of things, I think, because I think that the ideas we've shared are obviously something that we feel very passionate about and that we hope are going to be resonant and land well. I think that, as I just hinted to a moment ago, a lot of times people can get lost in the details of Pesach preparation. I'm going to say it a little bit stronger than that. I think it's easy to hide behind the details of Pesach preparation. And we could just be like, okay, well, we have to do all that cleaning and the cooking. And then like Pesach comes and we're like, but what's actually happening now, right? Like, what kind of experience we want to cultivate? And there's Leila Seder, and for some people there's two Leila Seder, and there's a whole Chag that we also have, right? Like I often say, like we can say all the complex Divrei Torah when we don't have 20 people at our table. Like let's say that
the lunch
meal, and the next Chag, and so what I really would want to just encourage, and I'm only saying this because I really do this myself, is that among whatever that prep looks like, it take an hour, right? We could sit down for a minute and think about these things by ourselves with the person that we're hosting with, but to think about like, what is it that we want to happen, whether it's on the Seder or the broader Chag holiday, and so that we can make it suitable for our guests, that people can be seen at the table, so that we can try and like cultivate what the atmosphere that we want. And also a question about like, what part of the story do we want to be telling this year? What do we want to be emphasizing, right? And I think that there just is no shortcut around taking some time to plan. And often it just gets lost in the physical preparations for the holiday. And I would even say it's coming out 2 weeks before Shana. Maybe some people are cleaning out. I'm definitely not. But maybe now's the time, before one is feeling really, really overwhelmed. Like, do it early, Look at those websites, check out some of those games. It's a really, really just nice way to come in and feel calm. It's a little bit like lesson planning, a teeny bit, right? But again, I think our role as, again, families that also want to educate, I think is really sitting at the heart of this holiday.
And especially this year, we see all of you out there who have 3 days in a row. We know
OMG.
that's simple, the cooking and the prep for that. So at this point, 2 weeks earlier, to take some time before you're in the thick of that and think about the content could be something that could be really, really, really great. For me, the Pesach Seder is one of those really powerful, concrete experiences, which reminds me of a passage that I once read from Rav Soloveitchik in Shirei Harav, where he writes about the unique experience of Judaism. And he says, with one hand, the Jew receives the message of the past, and with the other, he passes it on to the future. Through the merging of experiential memory and experiential anticipation, the Jew transcends temporal bounds and penetrates into eternity. And I feel like this is exactly what is going on at the Seder, meaning on this night, we reflect back and remember what happened to us in the past as if it's happening right now. We say, B'chol dor v'dor chayav adam lir'od et atzmo ki'ilu yetziat mitzrayim. Then in every generation, a person is supposed to see himself as if he himself or she herself was led out of Egypt, as if she herself left Mitzrayim. It's so experiential, like it's so real, it's so concrete. And on the other hand, at the same time, we open the door to Eliyahu Hanavi and we sing Lashana Abba B'Yushalayim and we yearn for a complete redemption. It's like, wait, we're in the past, we're in the future, where are we? So I think where we are is like how we are present in the present is what enables us to hold both of these things. Like the more that we could say, yes, with one hand, I'm holding the past, with the other, I'm holding the future. But right now, I'm present, I'm mindful, I'm here, I'm aware of the people around me, and I'm creating something right now, right here. That's what merges that past and that future. And Rav Soloveitchik, in a hesped that he once gave for the Tolner Rebbetzin, he talks about that one of the things that mothers especially, that women especially, can pass on to their children is this idea that Judaism expresses itself not only in formal compliance with the law, but also in a living experience. Meaning he says that he, from his mother, learned that there's a flavor, there's a scent, there's a warmth to mitzvot. And I think that like these two ideas, which are in different places in Rav Soloveitchik, about like connecting the past with the future by being, very present, and also helping the people at our Seder understand that this isn't just about, did I eat a kazayit matzah and how much more do I have to have? And was I yotze? But like, no, there's a warmth to mitzvot. There's an experience that's happening here. There's a flavor. There's something very visceral, very concrete, very physical. I think this is how we tell our story. This is what makes our story so powerful. This is why Jews all over the world, regardless of their affiliation or of their observance, connect to the Seder. Because the Seder is the way that we become another link in the chain that connects us both to our past and to our future and enables us to be very present right now, right here. Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach, Shana. Did this conversation move you or cause you to think about the topic in a new way? Please share these episodes with friends and family and start conversations about meaningful mitzvah observance. Make sure to check out the show notes for links on how this topic is discussed on Deracheha.org. Contact us with thoughts and questions at womentalkingmitzvot@gmail.com. Looking forward to our next conversation.